June 22, 1940, 3:14 p.m., Forest of Compiègne, France. The rail car sat in a clearing surrounded by beech trees that had stood silent through 2 wars. Inside, the air smelled of leather, old wood, and something sharper, the metallic scent of historical repetition. Outside, the June sun filtered through leaves that had witnessed this scene before, in reverse 22 years earlier. Then German officers had stood in the positions French generals occupied now. Then the victors had been allied. Now, the swastika hung from poles driven into French soil, and the men in gray uniforms sat where Foch had once dictated terms. General Charles Huntsiger entered the rail car at 3:15 p.m. His uniform was pressed. His face was carved from stone. Behind him, 3 other French officers moved with the precision of men performing a funeral. They did not speak. The German officers stood. The French sat. Papers were placed on the table, thick documents bound in leather folders, stamped with eagles and iron crosses. At 3:23 p.m., General Wilhelm Keitel began reading the terms. His voice was flat, procedural, emptied of triumph. The words were German. The translator spoke French with a Berlin accent. Huntsiger listened with his hands folded on the table before him. He did not look at Keitel. He looked at the table, at the papers, at the same wood where Matthias Erzberger had signed Germany's surrender in 1918. Hitler had chosen this rail car deliberately. Wagenlit 2419D. The exact carriage. The exact spot. History as theater, humiliation as architecture. They had expected rage. They had braced for cruelty. What they received was silence, cold, institutional, and somehow worse than shouting. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Not slowly, not through attrition, not through the grinding stalemate that had defined the previous war. The Wehrmacht had broken through the Ardennes on May 10th. By May 20th they had reached the Channel, cutting Allied forces in half. By June 14th, Paris was occupied. By June 17th, Marshal Philippe Pétain had requested an armistice. The speed of collapse had been total. An army of 5 million men, fortifications that had consumed decades and billions of francs, alliances that had seemed unbreakable, all rendered irrelevant in 46 days. The Maginot Line had been bypassed. The British had evacuated at Dunkirk. The French government had fled to Bordeaux, then to Vichy. Now, in a forest clearing chosen for symbolic humiliation, the formality of surrender was being executed with German precision. General Huntsiger had been given his instructions before entering the railcar. Sign nothing without consulting Bordeaux, accept no terms that violated French sovereignty, and maintain dignity regardless of circumstance. The first 2 instructions would prove impossible. The third would be all that remained. Keitel read for 37 minutes. The armistice terms were comprehensive. France would be divided into occupied and unoccupied zones. The occupied zone, containing Paris, the Atlantic coast, and all major industrial centers, would be administered by German military authority. The unoccupied zone would be governed by a French administration based in Vichy, nominally sovereign but functionally subordinate. The French army would be demobilized. Weapons would be surrendered. Fortifications would be dismantled. The French fleet would be neutralized under German and Italian supervision. French prisoners of war, 1.8 million men captured during the campaign, would remain in German captivity until a final peace treaty was signed. France would pay the costs of German occupation. 400 million francs per day. Approximately 20 million Reichsmarks. The sum was calculated to exceed the actual cost of occupation by a factor of 3. It was not reimbursement. It was tribute. French citizens who had fled to Britain would be returned to France or Germany upon request. French colonial territories would remain under Vichy control but would cooperate with Axis military operations. French industrial production would be redirected to support German war efforts. The terms were not negotiable. This was not a treaty between equals. This was capitulation, dressed in diplomatic language but stripped of diplomatic courtesy. Huntsiger listened without interruption. When Keitel finished, he asked for time to transmit the terms to Bordeaux for review. Keitel refused. The terms would be signed today or the Wehrmacht would resume offensive operations tomorrow. There would be no negotiation, no modification, no delay. At 6:50 p.m., after 3 hours of consultation via telephone with Bordeaux, Huntsiger received authorization to sign. He returned to the railcar at 6:50 p.m. The light outside had shifted. The forest was dimming toward evening. Inside, electric lamps had been lit. Huntsiger sat. Keitel sat. The papers were pushed across the table. Hunziker signed his name in ink that looked black under the lamplight but was actually dark blue, a detail photographers would note later when analyzing the documents. General Keitel signed. The other German officers signed. The French officers signed. At 6:51 p.m. on June 22, 1940, France formally surrendered to Germany. The ceremony had lasted 11 minutes. No speeches were delivered. No hands were shaken. The German officers stood, saluted, and departed. The French officers remained seated for approximately 2 minutes after the Germans left. Then they too stood, gathered their copies of the documents, and walked out into the French forest that was no longer entirely French. If this moment already changed how you see how nations fall, not through dramatic last stands but through signatures and silence, subscribe now. The next part will show you what surrender actually meant for the people who had to live it. The armistice took effect at 12:35 a.m. on June 25, 1940, after Italy signed a separate armistice with France. In the 73 hours between signature and implementation, France transformed. German forces that had been poised to advance into unoccupied territory pulled back to designated demarcation lines. French military units that had been preparing to continue fighting from North Africa or Britain stood down. The French fleet, anchored at Toulon and Mers el-Kebir, awaited instructions that would determine whether it would be neutralized peacefully or destroyed by former allies who feared German capture. On the morning of June 25, German troops began entering Paris not as conquerors but as occupiers. The distinction mattered. Conquerors destroyed. Occupiers administered. The Wehrmacht moved into French government buildings with clerks and typewriters, not demolition charges. They requisitioned hotels for headquarters, not rubble for fortifications. The occupation was designed to be correct. Not gentle, the terms were harsh, the subordination total, but correct. German soldiers were understanding orders to behave with discipline. Looting was prohibited. Assault was prohibited. The French population was to be treated with the formal courtesy one would extend to a defeated enemy who had fought honorably. This was not mercy. This was policy. Germany intended to extract maximum value from occupied France. Industrial production, agricultural output, financial tribute. That extraction required a functioning French economy and a French population that would work rather than resist. Brutality would generate resistance. Correctness would generate compliance. The policy was documented in Wehrmacht directives issued before the armistice. Soldiers were instructed to salute French officers still in uniform. They were to pay for goods purchased from French shops, in occupation marks that had dubious value but payment nonetheless. They were forbidden to requisition civilian property without written authorization from military government offices. Violations were punished. On June 27, 2 German soldiers were court-martialed for stealing wine from a French shop in Amiens. They received 30 days detention. The French shopkeeper received an apology and compensation. The incident was publicized in German military newspapers as an example of proper discipline. The French population responded with confusion. They had expected brutality. They had heard stories of Polish cities destroyed, of civilians shot, of occupations conducted with medieval savagery. Instead, they encountered German soldiers who stood in orderly lines at bakeries, who said, "Hail vous plate," when requesting directions, who offered cigarettes to children and played harmonicas in parks. This was not kindness. This was occupation by other means. Marie Vasseur was 19 years old on June 25, 1940. She lived in a village near Compiègne, 15 miles from where the armistice had been signed 3 days earlier. Her father had been killed at Sedan in May. Her brother was a prisoner of war, location unknown. She lived with her mother and younger sister in a stone house that had survived the German advance untouched. On the morning of June 25, German soldiers arrived in the village. They came in trucks, not tanks. They carried rifles but did not aim them. An officer, a captain whose French was accented but comprehensible, gathered the villagers in the square and read a proclamation. The village was now under German military administration. A curfew would be in effect from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. All firearms must be surrendered within 24 hours. All radios must be registered. All movements beyond 5 kilometers required written permission. Violations would be punished. Then the captain said something Marie would remember for the rest of her life. "We are not here to destroy. We are here to administer. If you comply with regulations, you will not be harmed. France has surrendered, but the French people remain. That is not nothing." Marie expected terror. What she found was bureaucracy. The Germans established an office in the mayor's building. They posted guards at intersections. They inventoried village resources, livestock, grain stores, fuel supplies. They created ration systems. They issued identity papers. Within a week, the village had adapted to rhythms that felt both alien and mundane. German soldiers bought bread from the baker. French farmers sold milk to German supply officers. Children watched German trucks pass and waved tentatively, receiving waves in return. Marie wrote in her diary on July 3, 1940, "They are not monsters. That is what frightens me most. If they were monsters, I would know how to hate them. But they are men who say please and thank you, who look tired, who show me photographs of their families when I sell them eggs. How do you resist politeness? How do you hate courtesy?" The occupation was not uniform. In Paris, German military bands played concerts in the Tuileries. In Bordeaux, German officers requisitioned the finest restaurants and paid in occupation currency that French restaurateurs accepted because refusal meant closure. In Lyon, German administrators worked alongside Vichy officials to maintain industrial production. But in Polish territories annexed by Germany, civilians were being systematically dispossessed. In concentration camps being constructed in the east, extermination was being organized. The correctness of the French occupation was strategic, not moral. France was valuable. France would produce. France would be bled economically, not destroyed physically. The French understood this gradually. The occupation was extractive. The 400 million francs per day drained French reserves. Requisitions of food, fuel, and manufactured goods created shortages. Young men were conscripted for labor service in Germany. Jewish residents of occupied France faced escalating restrictions that would culminate in deportations. But in June 1940, most French civilians experienced occupation as something closer to house arrest than extermination. They were restricted, subordinated, humiliated, but not massacred. The Wehrmacht was not the SS. The occupation was not the Holocaust. Not yet. Not in France. Not in 1940. That distinction would not last. By 1942, the Gestapo would operate openly in Paris. By 1943, French Jews would be deported to Auschwitz. By 1944, the milice, French collaborationist paramilitary, would torture resistance members in French prisons. The correct occupation of 1940 would decay into the terror of 1944. But in the summer of 1940, France was learning what it meant to be defeated without being destroyed. To surrender sovereignty while maintaining existence. To watch German soldiers walk French streets without firing a shot. If you're realizing that surrender is more complex than you thought, that defeat doesn't always look like flames and rubble, subscribe now. What comes next will show you how ordinary people navigated extraordinary contradictions. By August 1940, France had divided into two psychological zones that did not align with the official demarcation line. The first zone was occupied by Germans but inhabited by French who were learning to survive. The second zone was occupied by a question no one could answer. What does resistance look like when the occupier is correct? In Paris, intellectuals debated collaboration versus resistance in terms that were more philosophical than practical. Jean-Paul Sartre would later write about the occupation as a state of existential ambiguity where every action carried moral weight. But in 1940, most Parisians were simply trying to obtain ration cards and avoid curfew violations. In rural villages, resistance manifested in small refusals. A farmer who underreported his grain harvest. A shopkeeper who claimed to be out of stock when German soldiers entered. A priest who baptized Jewish children under French names. These were not armed uprisings. They were acts of friction, small obstacles that cumulatively slowed German extraction without triggering reprisal. But there was also compliance. French police enforced German regulations. French civil servants administered German directives. French factories produced goods for German use. This was not always collaboration born of sympathy. It was often survival born of necessity. If you did not work, you did not eat. If you did not comply, you were arrested. The Germans controlled food, fuel, freedom of movement, and access to information. Resistance required resources most people did not have. The Vichy government, operating from the unoccupied zone, promoted an ideology called the National Revolution. It emphasized traditional values, work, family, fatherland, and presented collaboration with Germany as the path to French renewal. Marshal Pétain, the hero of Verdun, lent his credibility to the project. His photograph hung in schools, town halls, and shops. His speeches were broadcast on radio. Pétain argued that France had been defeated because it had become weak, morally and militarily. The Third Republic had been corrupt. Democracy had been decadent. Defeat was punishment for decline. Regeneration required discipline, hierarchy, and cooperation with the new European order Germany was constructing. This narrative resonated with some French citizens. Others rejected it entirely. Most occupied a confused middle ground where they distrusted Vichy but saw no viable alternative. Britain was fighting alone, seemingly doomed. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany. The United States was neutral. German victory appeared total and permanent. In that context, resistance felt like romanticism. Compliance felt like realism. Simone Leclerc was 24 years old in 1940. She worked as a schoolteacher in Rouen, a city in the occupied zone. Before the war, she had been apolitical, concerned with literature, music, and her students. The occupation forced her to become something else. On September 12, 1940, a German officer visited her school. He did not demand anything. He asked if the school needed supplies, paper, pencils, chalk. The school did. The French educational system was collapsing under occupation. Teachers were using scraps of newspaper for writing practice. Simone accepted the supplies. That night, she wrote in her diary, "I took pencils from a German officer today. Does that make me a collaborator? The children need pencils. I am a teacher. My duty is to teach. But the pencils came from Germany and Germany is the enemy. How do I reconcile this? How does one resist while accepting charity?" Over the following months, Simone navigated increasingly complex moral terrain. She taught her students French history as required by Vichy curriculum, but emphasized the revolution and the Republic's ideals more than instructed. She accepted German supplies when refusing would have harmed her students, but declined invitations to social events organized by occupation authorities. In May 1941, Simone was approached by a colleague who was involved in early resistance activities, distributing underground newspapers, hiding British pilots, passing intelligence to free French networks. The colleague asked if Simone would help. Simone refused. Not because she supported Vichy or Germany, but because she believed her duty as a teacher mattered more than her potential role in resistance. Her students needed education. If she was arrested, they would lose a teacher. The calculus seemed clear. By 1943, Simone's calculus had changed. The occupation had hardened. The Gestapo was arresting French citizens on suspicion alone. Jewish students were being deported. The correctness of 1940 had decayed into brutality. Simone began hiding Jewish children in her apartment, providing them with false papers, and helping them escape to unoccupied Switzerland. She was arrested in March 1944. She was deported to Ravensbrück. She survived. When she returned to France in 1945, she resumed teaching. She never spoke publicly about her resistance work. When asked about the occupation, she said only, "I tried to remain human. That was harder than it should have been." The transformation of France between 1940 and 1944 was not linear. It was a slow erosion of correctness into cruelty, of occupation into oppression, of collaboration into complicity. In 1940, German soldiers were under orders to behave correctly. By 1944, those orders had been superseded by directives authorizing collective punishment, hostage execution, and deportation. The occupation that began as bureaucratic extraction ended as violent repression. The reasons were multiple. The war turned against Germany after Stalingrad. Resistance movements grew stronger. The Germans grew desperate. The veneer of correctness no longer served strategic purposes, so it was abandoned. But in 1940, when France surrendered in a rail car in Compiègne, the future was invisible. The French did not know they were witnessing the beginning of a 4-year descent. They knew only that their nation had fallen in 6 weeks, and they were being occupied by an enemy who said please and thank you while dismantling their sovereignty. On June 22, 1945, 5 years to the day after the armistice was signed, French officials gathered in the same forest clearing where the surrender had occurred. The railcar had been destroyed by SS forces in 1945 to prevent it from being used for a second German surrender. But the monument marking the site remained. General Charles de Gaulle, who had refused to accept the armistice and had led Free French forces throughout the war, stood where Huntseiger had stood 5 years earlier. He did not deliver a speech. He placed a wreath. He saluted. He left. France had been liberated in 1944. Germany had surrendered in 1945. The war was over. But the memory of June 22, 1940 remained, the day France signed away its sovereignty in a railcar chosen for maximum humiliation, and began 4 years of occupation that started with courtesy and ended with deportation trains. The French had learned what Americans and British would never fully understand. That defeat was not a moment but a condition. That occupation was not a uniform experience but a spectrum ranging from bureaucratic inconvenience to existential threat. That resistance was not always armed uprising but sometimes simply the refusal to forget that France had existed before the occupation and would exist after it. If you're understanding now that history is lived in shades of gray, not black and white, that surrender was the beginning of a story, not the end, subscribe. Because these are the stories that don't fit neat narratives, and that's exactly why they matter. Marie Vasseur, the 19-year-old who had sold eggs to polite German soldiers in 1940, survived the occupation. Her village was liberated by American forces in August 1944. She married a French soldier who had fought with the Free French in North Africa. She had 3 children. She lived until 1997. In 1985, she was interviewed by a historian researching civilian experiences of occupation. The historian asked if she had resisted. Marie's answer was preserved in the archive. I did not join the resistance. I did not hide British pilots or sabotage railways. I sold eggs and bread and tried to keep my family alive. Does that make me a collaborator? I do not know. I accepted German money for food because I needed money. I spoke to German soldiers because refusing would have made me a target. I survived. That was my resistance, surviving when they wanted us to disappear. The historian asked if she felt guilt. Marie said, every day. But guilt is a luxury of hindsight. In 1940, I was 19 and afraid. I made choices that kept me alive. Some of those choices helped Germans. Some helped French. Most helped no one. I'm not proud of everything I did. But I am alive. My children are alive. Perhaps that is enough. Simone Leclerc, the schoolteacher who accepted German pencils in 1940 and hid Jewish children in 1943, was recognized by Yad Vashem in 1987 as righteous among the nations. She refused to attend the ceremony. When the French ambassador to Israel asked why, she wrote, I do not deserve recognition for doing what should have been ordinary. I did not hide children because I was heroic. I hid them because they were children and they needed hiding. That should not require medals. That should be expected. The fact that it was not expected, that is the shame we must carry. France rebuilt after the war. The Fourth Republic was established in 1946. The economy recovered. The population grew. The memory of occupation faded into something safer, a story of resistance movements and heroic acts, of collaboration punished and liberty restored. But the complexity remained. The French who had lived through 1940 to 1944 knew what the post-war narratives obscured, that most people had neither resisted heroically nor collaborated enthusiastically. They had survived in the gray space between, making compromises that kept them alive but left them morally compromised. The armistice signed on June 22, 1940, was not the story of how France fell. It was the beginning of the story of how France endured. The surrender in the rail car was a formality. The real surrender, or the real resistance, happened in the 4 years that followed in kitchens and schools and factories and farms, where ordinary people made daily choices about how much to comply, how much to resist, and how to remain human under conditions designed to reduce them to subjects. The rail car where France surrendered was destroyed in 1945. A replica was constructed in the 1950s and placed in a museum near the original site. Tourists visit. They take photographs. They read plaques explaining what happened on June 22, 1940. But the plaques cannot convey the silence in the rail car when Huntsiger signed. They cannot describe the weight of the pen in his hand. They cannot capture the sound of boots on gravel as the German officers departed. They cannot explain what it meant for a nation to fall in 6 weeks and endure for 4 years. History books record that France surrendered on June 22, 1940. That is factually accurate and morally insufficient. Surrender was not a single act but a series of accommodations, each one small enough to justify, cumulatively large enough to constitute defeat. But survival was also a series of refusals, each one small enough to overlook, cumulatively large enough to constitute resistance. France surrendered to German soldiers on June 22, 1940. The French people surrendered daily for 4 years, and refused daily for 4 years. Both are true. Neither is complete. The war taught France how to fall. The occupation taught France how to endure. The liberation taught France how to remember. But the memory that emerged was cleaner than the experience. The post-war narratives emphasized resistance and minimized accommodation because nations need heroic stories to remain coherent. The truth was Messier. The truth was Marie selling eggs to German soldiers. The truth was Simone accepting German pencils. The truth was millions of French citizens navigating occupation by making compromises that kept them alive but did not make them heroes. That is not a failure. That is humanity under pressure. That is what surrender actually looks like. Not a signature in a rail car, but 1,000 daily decisions about how to live when sovereignty has been signed away. They surrendered in a forest in 1940. They survived in their villages for 4 years. And when liberation came, they learned that survival carried its own moral weight, lighter than collaboration, heavier than heroism, and more common than either.